So first video requested for just a discussion about what this requirement means. Simulate the user input. You can use arrays, methods, and program settings with global variables. And it's great that you asked this because I realized I'm not really using this as much. And part of this is we see this as an evolution of what we've been writing. Let me talk about that and then I'll circle back around and talk about simulating the idea. So again, I told you I shared right in our playground, and I'm going to go look at, because we see some of this global setup, at least in my code, a little more at the beginning when we were really not using anything but if statements, right? So these are global. So if you have a let player equal or let so I have set player to total games, total wins, right? And selection. These are the idea of setting global variables. Now I needed it more at the beginning of the code that we were writing. And what you see is kind of a natural evolution over time where on my one that I just finished for this week 5, I noticed that really, and what I have here is now instead of having variables that are on the global scope, I do have objects that are on the global scope. But in this case, it's a nicer way to do it because I can encapsulate the idea of a player, right? And a player 1 or a player 2. You could also encapsulate the idea of maybe things about the game itself, right? Author, creator, date, version. That would be great things to keep track of for that as well. So in this sense, and I appreciate that, is that we tend to see a move away from as many of the global variables into more encapsulation of the concepts of arrays and in this case objects, right? So thank you. I wouldn't mark off if you didn't have any let equal setting out on the global scope. But the other thing is to understand the importance of the difference between the global scope and the block scope. Okay, so in this case, I do have some things setting out on global. They are objects. Okay, and I'm glad you asked it because I could easily put some other higher program data that I might want to keep on there. So let me now just talk for a minute about the idea of simulating the user input. And I realize this is probably not the best example because what I ended up doing here, but it is an example, and I'll show you another one in a minute I think does better. And the reason I think this one's not the best is I ended up doing a selection of random integer between 1 and 10. Based on that, I had my game invoked by a random selection of player as well. So I had the idea of more, at least I wasn't manually calling them. But let me actually show you one that I think is a little better example. And it's the one that I need to publish. That is because if you remember, I ended up doing 2 examples of the learn togethers. So here's one, right? So in this case, I have the objects setting out here are person 1 and person 2, and this is the idea of tracking workouts. So the simulation of the user input is I'm going to save activity data. I'm going to pass it an object. I'm going to pass it some string data that's going to become activity in the function call and an integer, and which will become duration. Right, so this is the idea of simulating the idea of user input, and in this case, I'm using objects that were out on the global scope. So now, let me walk through just at least this first one where I say I'm calling save activity data. I'm passing in the person. Now remember, why I'm not calling it person 1 is so that when I call this function, I can call it with different persons. So a level, I don't know if it's a full level of abstraction, but it's a way to, because you can pass whatever you pass in, you can name it differently. What's important is the order at which you're passing it in, right? So in this case, person, and the first call is person 1. Activity is running. Again, I just named it instead of calling it running. That if I had called it running on the function call, I couldn't have called it more than once or with different types of activities. And with duration, It's, again, I'm passing an integer, but I'm actually naming it duration so it can abstract and run some code related to that. So then I do some calculation based on, simple calculation based on the kind of activity. And then I end up pushing, and this is the idea, is the user gives you input, and then you capture that input. In this case, I'm doing a push because I have a activity details setting on the person object, and I call activity. So in this case, don't let this confuse you. This is the property name, and this is actually the property. You learn later that you can actually, when they're the same, just drop the second reference. But in this case, I went ahead and fully showed the details so you could see it. So I did duration. So in this case, this is actually what I'm pushing. This is the detail I'm pushing: activity, duration, and calories. So calories was something I determined. So then I could go back and look at that. The idea of user gave me information, the information, right, of simulating the idea of that person is running for 20 minutes. And the reason I like this is because I use activity, workout app, an activity for a lot of different activities. But that's the idea, is I choose the activity because the program can handle multiple users. I'm simulating the idea of that particular user, and in this case, that particular user's duration, right? So I hope that helps explain. I thank you for the question because it is a good one, and it makes me think I might, because this doesn't say you have to have these global variables, but you definitely can, because I'm using my objects. Well, and they're not as program settings, so there may be some other program settings that you would want to do, but we do see an evolution as well. If you look at some of the, like if you compare week 1, and let me just go look at it from the workout perspective, the one I had done, because I showed each week because I wanted to have the students see the evolution, is that we saw a bit more of the variable set on the global scope. So one of the things you're going to hear me talk about is that it is a good idea whenever possible to encapsulate your data into other higher forms of data objects, arrays, right? But there are still things that you could put out on the global scope. Like in the case of the example I was just looking at, I could put maybe the name of the app, the name of the coder, maybe some other kind of data that would just be looked at as a global, like I'd want to have that access to that data anywhere in my code. But the idea is, over time, we can also use other ways to encapsulate that data, as we see when we look all the way out to the example that I just showed, because these objects are setting out on the global scope, and then they give me access to that person, but I could easily, right? So I could easily then also just have maybe, right, const equals, or how about app name equals my workout app. And then if I do it this way, then I could, wherever I'm outputting, I could actually output the app name. I could also put constant developer would be equal to, right? And then I could do something like, oops, helps when you spell your name right. And then I could put, but see, as I'm doing these, this almost feels like I should do this as an object. That makes more sense. But I'm just giving you the idea. Like the current version might be, right, 4.506, right? We could talk about whether we want to do it that way. So anyway, it's the idea. And then maybe some of these things I would want and need to have out on the global scope so that I could output them somewhere in my code. Okay, thank you, Hugo, for that question. Please let me know if that helps clarify, if there's anything else you'd like me to do. Appreciate the question.